There are moments in American political history that stop the clock, moments when the machinery of the most powerful legislative body on earth simply grinds to a halt. Not because of some great constitutional crisis, not because of a foreign threat, not because of a natural disaster, but because of something far more embarrassing. A typo, a procedural oversight, a one-paragraph rule that the party in power could not get right. And on this particular Wednesday morning at precisely 11:10 in the morning, 4 words echoed across the floor of the United States House of Representatives that sent shockwaves through every Republican member seated in that chamber. 4 words spoken not by a Republican, not by an ally of the Speaker, not by anyone with power on that side of the aisle, but by the Democrat they respect most when it comes to knowing how their own institution works. 4 words that unraveled hours of planning, weeks of negotiations, and an entire administration's legislative agenda, at least for the day. Those 4 words were simple, devastating, and impossible to ignore. It has a mistake in it. What followed was 11 hours of paralysis, panic, political theater, and passionate speeches that laid bare the human cost of what Republicans are trying to pass into law. This is the story of one of the most chaotic and consequential days the House of Representatives has seen in recent memory. And it is a story that is far from over. To understand the full weight of what happened on the floor of the House of Representatives this Wednesday, it is important to understand who delivered that bombshell announcement and why everyone in that chamber, Republican and Democrat alike, stopped and listened. Congressman Jim McGovern, Democrat of Massachusetts, serves as the Democratic leader of the House Rules Committee. In the world of congressional procedure, Jim McGovern is not simply knowledgeable. He is, by virtually universal acknowledgement among members of both parties, the single most authoritative expert on House rules currently serving in the chamber. When Jim McGovern speaks about procedure, members listen, including Republicans who would ordinarily tune out anything a Democrat says the moment they open their mouth. This morning they could not afford to, because Jim McGovern had found something that the Republican majority, in their rush to meet what Democrats are calling an artificial July 4th deadline set by President Donald Trump, had simply missed, and what he found threatened to bring the entire Republican legislative operation to its knees. Here is what happened in precise detail. The House Rules Committee, controlled by Republicans and chaired by Virginia Foxx of North Carolina, had worked through the night to produce a rule governing floor debate on the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, President Trump's sweeping domestic policy legislation. In the House of Representatives, unlike the Senate, every single piece of legislation that comes to the floor is governed by a specific individually drafted rule written by the Rules Committee. This rule determines how long debate will last, whether amendments will be permitted, and crucially, what procedural options members will have once debate begins. Senate rules are standing, permanent, and written down in a document that does not change session to session. House rules are custom written for each bill every single time. It is painstaking work requiring precision and expertise. And at approximately 2 in the morning, after the Republican majority on the Rules Committee had voted to send their rule to the full House floor, Jim McGovern and his Democratic colleagues found the error. The Republicans had forgotten to include language that is known in procedural terms as considering the previous question as ordered. In plain English, what this means is catastrophic for Republican leadership. Without that language, once Republicans begin floor debate on the bill, they have no escape hatch. If they start the debate and then realize midstream that they do not have the votes to pass the legislation, they cannot simply pause, regroup, and live to fight another day. They are locked in. They must take the vote. Even if that vote results in a humiliating public defeat on the floor of the House of Representatives, broadcast live across the nation. Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, a Republican from Louisiana who assumed the speakership after one of the most turbulent leadership battles in modern congressional history, learned of this mistake the same way everyone else did, from Jim McGovern on the floor. at 11:10 in the morning in front of the entire House of Representatives and the American public watching at home. The implications were immediate and far-reaching, because what Jim McGovern's announcement revealed beyond the procedural embarrassment was something even more damaging to Republican leadership. It revealed that at the moment McGovern made his announcement, Speaker Johnson did not have the votes, not for the rule, not for the bill. The Republican majority in the House is thin, and holding it together on a piece of legislation this sweeping, this consequential, and this controversial has proven extraordinarily difficult. The mistake in the rule exposed that fragility to the entire world at the worst possible moment. McGovern did not stop with the announcement of the error. He pressed forward using the procedural opening his discovery had created to deliver a broader indictment of the entire process. He reminded his colleagues and the watching public that Republicans had been rushing this legislation from the very beginning. He asked, with pointed logic that cut through the political noise, if the Republican leadership cannot get a one-paragraph rule right, can they really be trusted to have gotten an 870-page bill right? His question was not rhetorical. It was an invitation to examine what might be lurking inside nearly 900 pages of legislation that has been moving at breakneck speed through a Congress where members have barely had time to read it, let alone scrutinize every line. To understand the historical significance of what happened in that chamber on this Wednesday, it is necessary to travel back through the long and often turbulent history of House procedural battles. The House Rules Committee itself has been called the most powerful committee in Congress, sometimes nicknamed the traffic cop of the House because it controls what legislation reaches the floor, under what conditions, and with what limitations on debate. For most of its modern history, the committee has been an instrument of iron discipline for the majority party. Speaker Sam Rayburn of Texas, who served as Speaker longer than any other person in American history, used the Rules Committee to throttle legislation he disapproved of and advance the agenda of the Democratic majority he led for decades. When Republicans took control of the Rules Committee in 1995 under Speaker Newt Gingrich, they transformed it into an equally powerful tool of majority party control, tightening procedures and limiting the minority's ability to offer amendments, a practice that has only accelerated in the years since. The idea that a mistake this fundamental, this basic, this elementary would slip through the Rules Committee undetected is, by all accounts, without modern precedent. Members of both parties, observers, and congressional scholars have noted that nothing quite this procedurally embarrassing has happened in living memory. The Republican chairwoman of the Rules Committee, Virginia Foxx of North Carolina, has long been a figure whose competence has been questioned by members of her own party, though rarely stated so bluntly in public. Her staff, responsible for the technical drafting of these rules, bears significant responsibility for the oversight that Jim McGovern exposed in the early hours of this legislative morning. The episode stands as a stark illustration of the consequences when institutional expertise is sidelined, when the people who know the rules best are not the ones writing them, and when political pressure from a White House demanding speed overrides the careful, methodical work that sound legislation requires. The parallels to other moments of rushed and flawed legislating in American history are hard to ignore. The Affordable Care Act rollout, the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act passed in the middle of the night with handwritten margin notes, the rushed COVID relief negotiations of 2020. Each of these episodes produced unintended consequences that took years to fully understand and address. The question Jim McGovern asked Wednesday morning is one that historians may be asking for years to come. The central figures in this drama are people whose careers and public records tell the larger story of American politics at this inflection point. Jim McGovern, now in his 14th term representing Massachusetts' 2nd Congressional District, has spent decades mastering the arcane but enormously consequential world of House procedure. Born in Worcester, Massachusetts, McGovern worked as a congressional aide before winning his seat in 1996. He has been a consistent voice for food security policy, having authored significant hunger-related legislation, and has served as one of the most technically proficient members of the Democratic caucus throughout his career. His decision to announce the rule error on the floor, rather than simply exploit it quietly, reflects both his deep knowledge of the institution and his understanding that a public announcement would maximize political pressure on Republicans. Speaker Mike Johnson of Louisiana presents a striking contrast. First elected to Congress in 2016, Johnson rose with remarkable speed through the Republican caucus before being elevated to the speakership in October 2023, following the unprecedented removal of Kevin McCarthy by a faction of hard-right Republican members. Johnson's speakership has been defined by the extraordinarily narrow margin of his majority, the demands of a deeply divided Republican caucus, and the enormous pressure from the Trump White House to deliver on the president's legislative agenda. Johnson is a former constitutional attorney and a deeply conservative member who has navigated an almost impossible political terrain. But his management of the Rules Committee process on the Big Beautiful Bill has now produced an embarrassment that will follow him regardless of how the ultimate vote turns out. Virginia Foxx, the Republican chair of the House Rules Committee, represents North Carolina's 5th congressional district and has been in Congress since 2005. Foxx has long been a reliable conservative vote, but has not cultivated a reputation as a procedural expert or institutional innovator. Her committee's failure to catch the error that Jim McGovern identified at 2 in the morning raises serious questions about the management of what is arguably the most technically demanding committee assignment in the House. The legislative vehicle at the center of this drama, the bill Republicans are calling the Big Beautiful Bill, and which critics have taken to calling the Big Ugly Bill, is a sprawling piece of domestic policy legislation that attempts to accomplish multiple major policy objectives simultaneously. At its core, the bill extends and expands the tax cuts originally enacted during President Trump's first term in office, cuts that are scheduled to expire under current law. It also makes significant changes to Medicaid, the federal state health insurance program that covers over 80 million low-income Americans, children, elderly individuals in nursing homes, and people with disabilities. Additionally, the legislation makes major reductions to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program known as SNAP, which provides food assistance to approximately 42 million Americans, many of them children. The political, economic, social, legal, and international dimensions of this legislation are vast and deeply consequential. Politically, the bill represents the central domestic legislative achievement that President Trump and Republicans have staked their political credibility on delivering. Republican leadership has been promising the conservative base significant tax relief and a dramatic reduction in the size of the federal government for years. The Big Beautiful Bill is, in their framing, the fulfillment of that promise. But the political math inside the House Republican caucus has proven far more complicated. Republicans who represent districts with large Medicaid populations, rural hospitals that depend on Medicaid reimbursements for their survival, and communities heavily reliant on SNAP benefits have found themselves caught between their loyalty to the party and their president on one side and the immediate visible harm their constituents will face on the other. The number of Republican members who have expressed reservations, demanded modifications, or outright signaled opposition has been sufficient to threaten the bill's passage throughout this process. Wednesday's procedural chaos made that underlying arithmetic brutally visible. Economically, the stakes are enormous on every dimension. The Democratic amendment offered in the United States Senate that would have restored the income tax rate on incomes above $10 million to 39.6%, the exact rate that applied during both the Clinton and Obama presidencies, was rejected by every Republican senator. This vote to protect the lowest possible tax rate for the highest possible incomes at 37% under the Republican plan compared to 39.6% 6% under Clinton and Obama, represents a fundamental philosophical commitment that Republicans have made explicitly. The mathematics of this choice are striking. During the Clinton years, when the top marginal rate was 39.6%, the American economy experienced one of the longest peacetime expansions in its history. Billionaires accumulated extraordinary wealth. The stock market boomed. Unemployment fell to historic lows. The argument that a 2.5% difference in the marginal rate on incomes above $10 million is economically meaningful in any measurable way for those taxpayers strains credibility. What it does do is add to the national debt. Multiple independent analyses, including projections from the Congressional Budget Office, suggest the legislation would add approximately $4 trillion to the national debt over the coming decade. The social impact of the Medicaid and SNAP cuts is where the human cost of this legislation becomes most vivid and most contested. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York, one of the most prominent voices in the House Democratic caucus, delivered a speech on the floor Wednesday that cut through the political abstraction with personal and statistical force. Ocasio-Cortez, who has spoken publicly about her own experience working as a bartender and relying on tips as a significant portion of her income before entering politics, addressed directly the bill's provision eliminating income taxes on tips, one of President Trump's signature campaign promises. She noted that the provision caps the tax-free tip benefit at $25,000 annually and argued that for workers who actually live off tips, the mathematical trade-off being offered in this bill is devastating. In exchange for a capped tax benefit on tips, those same workers stand to lose their Medicaid coverage, their SNAP benefits, and their Affordable Care Act health insurance extensions. For a family living paycheck to paycheck in the service industry, Ocasio-Cortez argued this is not a trade, it is a trap. The specific numbers Democrats cited on the floor Wednesday give the abstract policy debate a human face. In the North Carolina district of Republican Congresswoman Virginia Foxx, the very chairwoman whose committee produced the flawed rule, 142,000 constituents stand to lose some or all of their SNAP benefits under this legislation. 5 rural hospitals in that district are at risk of closure as a result of the Medicaid provisions. In Pennsylvania, the districts represented by Republican Congressman Rob Bresnahan and Congressman Scott Perry are projected to see 30,000 and 25,000 people respectively lose access to health care, while 60,000 and 40,000 households respectively face the potential loss of food assistance. Democrats read these numbers into the congressional record not as abstract statistics but as a political warning. They name names. They identified specific Republican members whose support for this legislation in districts where the human cost will be immediately and viscerally felt, they believe will cost those members their seats in the next congressional election. Congressman Jamie Raskin of Maryland, a former constitutional law professor and one of the most intellectually formidable members of the Democratic caucus, offered a piece of legislative performance art that captured the sentiment of the Democratic opposition with devastating wit. Raskin presented what he called the preamble to the Big Ugly Bill, a parody of the constitutional preamble that inverted every aspiration of the founding document. His parody preamble, read into the congressional record, described a legislative agenda designed to benefit billionaires, explode the national debt, strip health care from 17 million Americans, and cut 42 million people off from nutritional assistance. The speech drew applause and laughter in the chamber and quickly circulated across social media platforms, reaching audiences far beyond the walls of Congress. Meanwhile, across the street at the White House, President Trump spent the day conducting what the New York Times described as a blunt force charm offensive targeting wavering Republican House members. A steady stream of Republican lawmakers filed through the West Wing throughout the day, meeting individually with the president in sessions designed to shore up support and address the concerns of members who had been publicly or privately expressing doubts about the legislation. 13 individual Republican members were identified entering the White House throughout the day. According to reporting by The Times, those members emerged from their meetings with signed merchandise, photographs taken in the Oval Office, and in at least some cases a renewed enthusiasm for the bill they had been questioning. The Times account describes a president who has refined the art of making individual members of Congress feel personally valued and politically connected to him, a skill that has proven effective in managing a caucus that is simultaneously ideologically fractured and politically dependent on Trump's continued support with their base voters. One of the Republican members who emerged from this White House engagement process with a conspicuous change of position was Congressman Derek Van Orden of Wisconsin, who had been among those Republicans publicly expressing concern about the Medicaid provisions in the bill. Van Orden, who represents Wisconsin's 3rd Congressional District and has spoken about the importance of protecting health care for his constituents, appeared to abandon those objections after his engagement with the White House. His explanation for the reversal became immediately notable not for its policy reasoning, but for its striking choice of language. "We're not a bunch of little bitches around here," Van Orden told reporters, insisting that members of Congress had arrived at their support for the bill independently and were not simply responding to presidential pressure. The statement, which spread rapidly across cable news and social media, was widely interpreted as doing the opposite of what Van Orden intended, highlighting rather than dispelling the impression that Republican members were caving to White House pressure. The fact that Van Orden represents a district that includes exactly one billionaire among its approximately 800,000 residents, while 152,900 of those residents are enrolled in Medicaid, made the juxtaposition between his defiant rhetoric and his policy choices particularly sharp. Legal questions surrounding this legislation extend well beyond the procedural drama of Wednesday's floor fight. The constitutionality of certain provisions, particularly those affecting the structure of Medicaid, which is a joint federal-state program with its own complex legal architecture, may well face court challenges. The precedent of major changes to entitlement programs has consistently generated litigation, and the scope of the cuts proposed here is without modern precedent. The Affordable Care Act itself survived multiple Supreme Court challenges, and legal scholars watching this legislation have already begun identifying provisions that may face similar scrutiny. The speed with which this legislation is being moved and the limited opportunity for careful legal review that speed entails only increases the likelihood that problematic provisions will emerge over time. Internationally, the implications of this legislation are being watched with considerable attention. Allied governments in Europe and elsewhere have been tracking the trajectory of American domestic policy under the current administration with a mixture of concern and strategic calculation. The prospect of a $4 trillion increase in the American national debt over the coming decade has implications for global financial markets, for the value of dollar-denominated assets, and for the long-term fiscal capacity of the United States to meet its international commitments. Foreign policy analysts have noted that the combination of reduced domestic investment in health and nutrition programs, increased defense spending embedded in the legislation, and a tax structure that concentrates benefits at the very top of the income distribution creates a set of domestic political tensions that could have unpredictable consequences for American foreign policy engagement over the coming years. Political analysts observing Wednesday's events have noted that the procedural collapse exposed something important about the current state of Republican governance that goes beyond the specifics of a single piece of legislation. The inability to produce a clean, error-free, one-paragraph rule for a bill that Republican leadership has been working on for months suggests institutional dysfunction that runs deeper than any single staff failure. The pressure to meet an externally imposed deadline, the July 4th target set by President Trump, has compressed the deliberative process that careful legislation requires. The result, analysts note, is a set of circumstances in which the minority party has been handed procedural and political gifts that a competent majority would not have provided. Public polling on the specific provisions of this legislation has consistently shown significant opposition to cuts in Medicaid and SNAP programs, even among Republican-leaning voters in rural areas who depend on those programs. The political risk for Republican members in competitive districts is real, and Wednesday's floor drama did nothing to reduce it. Looking ahead, the immediate questions are several and pressing. Speaker Johnson faces the challenge of producing a corrected rule, getting it through the Rules Committee and bringing it back to the floor with enough votes to pass, all while managing a caucus that has demonstrated its willingness to break from leadership at inconvenient moments. The White House's charm offensive will continue, and the president's ability to apply personal pressure to individual members should not be underestimated. Trump has shown throughout his political career that he is extraordinarily effective at the retail politics of persuasion, particularly with members of his own party who fear the consequences of crossing him with their base. The July 4th deadline, which Democrats have consistently dismissed as artificial and arbitrary, nonetheless creates a sense of urgency that Republicans have internalized and that shapes the pace and texture of these negotiations. The Senate dimension of this story also remains unresolved. The rejection of the Democratic amendment that would have restored the 39.6% rate on incomes above $10 million represents the clearest possible statement of Republican priorities. Every Republican senator voted to protect those incomes at the lower rate. That vote is now part of the public record, and Democrats intend to make it so in the campaigns that follow. The dynamics between the House and Senate on this legislation, with each chamber having its own political pressures and its own members' concerns, add another layer of complexity to a legislative process that is already operating at the outer limits of manageability. What to watch for in the hours and days immediately ahead is a picture that is coming into clearer focus, even as its ultimate resolution remains genuinely uncertain. Can Speaker Johnson produce a corrected rule that passes the full House with his narrow majority intact? Can he then hold those same votes for the underlying legislation? Will the members who entered the White House on Wednesday and emerged with photographs and signed merchandise maintain their support when the actual vote comes? Will any of the Republicans who have expressed concern about Medicaid and SNAP find a procedural or political mechanism to register that concern in a way that affects the outcome? And what will the response be from constituents in districts across the country as the specific numbers attached to their communities become better known and more widely circulated? As Wednesday drew to a close and the 11-hour paralysis of the Republican House majority began to lift, the broader significance of what this day revealed was becoming impossible to dismiss. The Big Beautiful Bill, as its proponents call it, is a piece of legislation that will determine the health care of 17 million Americans, the food security of 42 million more, the tax burden of the wealthiest individuals this country has ever produced, and the national debt that will be carried by every American for decades to come. It was nearly derailed on Wednesday, not by principled opposition, not by a constitutional challenge, not by any of the large forces that usually shape American legislative history, but by a mistake in a one-paragraph rule that the party in power could not get right. Jim McGovern, the Democrat they would rather not have to listen to, told them what they had done wrong. And for 11 hours, the Republican House of Representatives sat with that truth, unable to move forward, unable to go back, unable to escape the consequences of their own carelessness. The question now, as it has been throughout this legislative fight, is what comes next. And the answer to that question will shape the lives of tens of millions of Americans in ways that will be felt for a generation. Stay with us.